Hey guys, it's Micah with Easton. Today we're going to install a 1,500 gallon basin with a fountain on top so that we can harvest the rainwater from the roof. We're going to try and install this in 2 days, but we have an extremely limited access to the front yard, so I think that might end up slowing us down. One of the things that I love about this property is all the vegetation. He has flower beds and gardens throughout the entire backyard and almost no grass. The little bit of grass that he does have, it's clover. So it just has this very picturesque English garden overgrown kind of vibe. And he wanted to add a way that he could harvest rainwater from the roof and water his flower bed. Now, the cool part about it is there's already an area that you see here in frame that was just collecting water. The roof comes to a valley and the water just shoots off at this point. And because of the clay in the soil, there's nowhere for that water to go. We thought that this would be the perfect place for an extra large basin. So when it does rain heavy, all that water can shoot off the roof and go straight into our basin. Smart thinking. The only problem is getting to this spot is extremely difficult. We have about a 5-foot wide path all the way to the backyard, which means big equipment won't fit without tearing up this beautiful garden that I just mentioned. We had originally created the design for this basin, talked about doing a 9x13, and the plan was to move a few of the planter beds that are in the yard already out of the way to make space for it. As we started to play around with moving those planter beds around, we realized that it was going to really get in the way of the rest of his yard. So he'd asked if we could crunch it down. Not really thinking all about it. I was like, absolutely. If we need to go a tiny bit deeper and make the footprint of it smaller, that won't be an issue. So we ended up with about a 5x8 footprint from our 13x9. Well, I hadn't really thought that through very well. Essentially meant we were going to end up with a close to 6-foot deep hole and going to make it very difficult for us to dig in clay with the small machine that we have. Live and learn, but that essentially meant that our 2-day time window for getting this project done is now out the window. I think the biggest lesson that I learned here was that when you go deeper, it makes it far more difficult. The machine is at a weird angle. So my brother, James, who's driving the machine, he's got that arm all the way down in the hole and he's scraping as best he can. And you could see Donnie and Christian stomping around in the hole as well. It was just an interesting aspect to go down in the ground so far, because generally we're like no more than 3 feet in the ground. So this depth definitely gave us a little bit of a different experience, but the ground at that depth is hard. So our machine, we're scraping and pulling and using pry bars to get this clay dug. Nice thing about it is it doesn't move, it doesn't shift. So as we dug it, it kept the exact shape that we dug out and didn't go anywhere. It's funny, we've gotten a lot of comments about why was this feature built so deep on some of our short form content that we've put on Facebook and Instagram. And people are speculating because we didn't want it to freeze. And trust me, this is coastal Virginia. It doesn't get so cold. I think our frost line is maybe 3 or 4 inches down in the ground. This was, as Bob Ross would say, a happy little accident that we ended up this deep. Now that our excavation is done, we've done our dry fit with our aqua blocks. It's time to get our underlayment, which is the fabric that you see going in first. And this fabric, what it does is there could be roots or even old glass or different particulates in the ground. And what that underlayment does is it just makes sure that the liner, the EPDM liner that we use to hold the water in this basin doesn't get punctured. So we put a layer of that underlayment down. We put our 45 mil EPDM liner, which is a very tough, it's like super thick rubber. So we put that in the hole next. And then we put another layer of this underlayment, which is the black fabric looking stuff. And the reason that we put another layer on the inside is the corners of these aqua blocks are actually fairly sharp. They could actually puncture, rip through the aqua blocks, and we don't want that to happen. So we put this second layer of underlayment on the inside. We put our aqua blocks in, we pack them, and then we fold all of the liner and underlayment back onto the top of this basin. Now, the reason we're doing that, and we actually call this a taco, jokingly we call it a taco because it's kind of like wrapping up a taco. But the reason we do that is we want to very carefully and methodically pack soil along the outside of our excavation. And that's what holds our aqua blocks tight to each other. That's actually what makes them structural as well. Because if the soil isn't packed super tight around these aqua blocks, they're kind of loose, they can kind of wiggle, and over time the pressures of soil and even the boulders that we're going to put on the top can cause them to sway apart or drift apart. And when they do that, they become weaker individually. So it's like when they're all clumped together, they're very strong. But if they start to separate or get out of line, stepping on them the wrong way or a boulder, kind of putting them on a rack can start to break the little pieces of plastic. And we really don't want that to happen. There's one other element that you see in with these aqua blocks, and this is our boot or our foot. You see it's the very long plastic piece that doesn't look like the other aqua blocks. It's kind of solid looking. Essentially what this does, and you notice how it's in the middle of the aqua blocks, but essentially what this does is it gives us access to the bottom of all of these aqua blocks. And it's actually about 9 inches lower than the last aqua block. And what that does, it gives us a place to get all the way to the bottom of the aqua blocks, but it also gives us a place to house our pump. So our pump is lower than all the aqua blocks, which allows us access to all 1,500 gallons. Because if the pump was just sitting on the bottom of one of these aqua blocks, we wouldn't have access to all 1,500 gallons. Maybe the last 100 gallons as it's spread out across the bottom, you might kind of have like a slurping action to get it. Where with this pump in this foot, 9 inches below all the aqua blocks, we have access to probably all but maybe 5 gallons of this 1,500 gallons, which is very nice for our homeowner because if there's a drought type situation, this basin is full from a rain. Okay, so our taco is built, which is our basin with the aqua blocks, our liner, our underlayment, they're all in place. We've packed around all of these components. Now it's time to open that taco up. You can see Jim getting down in that basin and he's smoking his pipe. Now that we've got all this, it's time for us to actually get to what we would call the sexy part of this feature, which is our fountain. Now, we're not doing a crazy fountain. We're not trying to do anything that's elaborate, but there is a screened in porch right here that they are going to be sitting at and looking out over their garden, watching the birds, watching their pollinators come and go. So it was important that the feature be facing the house and the screened in porch and not kind of facing the yard and where they're going to be gardening, just so they can have that experience and enjoy it. So we opted for a two, or I say we, they opted for a 2-bowl setup. So we've got 2 spillway bowls. These are 32 inches across. They have kind of this aqua blue, aqua green kind of coloring to them. So really nice and simple bowl. The thing I like most about these is they actually give you kind of a pocket of water. So I frequently see the birds perch on the edge of these and just take a bath and kind of splash around in them. Another thing that I really like is the water, it doesn't lap up over the edges. But the edges do tend to stay kind of damp, which is really great for pollinators because a lot of times bees, they will land on damp areas and they'll kind of, suck the water out while it's damp. They don't want to land on a pool of water. I mean, I have seen bumblebees land right on the surface of water that has a good surface tension, but frequently they want to land, water adjacent. They don't want to land in the water to get there. To drink. So by having these bowls that the water kind of splashes up on the edges, it's a perfect landing spot for the bees to come and get a drink out of it. So it's very pollinator friendly as well. So our plumbing is fairly straightforward. We're using flex lines to go up into these bowls. We only have a 2,000 gallon per hour Aquascape Ultra pump. It's not pushing a ton of water, but it's pushing just enough where that sound is going to be great. What we're doing at this point, you can see Donnie, Christian, and Jim kind of working on the plumbing, and it's going into a circular box. And what that circular box is, that is going to be our junction point to where he can take a hose and use the water in the garden outside of this system. So what we're doing is the pump's coming up into that valve box, and we have a valve that we can close. And when we close that, it stops the water going to the bowls and puts all of the pressure onto the hose. And so that pump is going to pump up, go into the valve box. The valve's going to divert it to the hose. When it's on, it's going to go right back to the bowls. When it's off, it's going to go to the hose. And we did put an extra valve in there just in case you didn't want all the pressure going through the hose. There's an extra valve that just returns it right back into the basin, because we don't want the pump to put too much pressure and just not put any water out. It could overheat. So if he cracks that second ball valve just a little bit, it'll always have some bypass going back in. The pump that we're using is an Ultra 2000, like I mentioned, and we picked this pump in particular because it has what's called a mag drive. So the impeller has magnets on two sides of it, and then it goes into a shaft, and it's just loosely set in there. And the reason that this pump is important is if for whatever reason it gets too much pressure on it, or it can't push anymore, it doesn't cause it to overheat majorly, because the impeller just stops moving because the magnet isn't that's surrounding the impeller isn't strong enough to keep it moving. So it's kind of just like it's a safety measure, if you will, for us in how we built this water feature, because we didn't want that to be an issue where it's like, oh, he forgot to turn the hose valve off and turn the water feature back on, but the pump is still running. So it's just a way of us just making sure that there wasn't any issues in the future with that pump. One of the cool things about this feature, and you can see how Jim is working right now, is we actually pulled the liner back quite a bit over top of this basin to make it look smaller. So I know this basin was already a smaller footprint than what we had originally planned on, but we're making it look even smaller because we can lap that liner back over top of the basin and then put soil on top of that liner. It's protecting it so that soil doesn't go down in there, but it also makes the feature just look a little bit more petite. So it's kind of like a tiny giant, if you will. Nobody would ever guess that there's a 1,500 gallon basin underneath of this thing, and that's exactly what our clients wanted. One other feature to note that we're putting in here is the downspout on the right side of the screen. You can see we've got a 4-inch PVC pipe coming off that downspout, and it's going right to where Christian is working right now. It's just coming right into the basin, and that's just to make sure, like in a light rain, that we're still capturing as much water as possible. That downspout was kind of shedding water away from this basin, but we wanted to get as much of that water into this basin as possible, because our homeowner definitely is thinking that he's going to use a lot of this water. So in a case where that there's a drought, we want to make sure even the lightest rain fills up our basin. Last item of specialty in this water feature is the lighting. So we put a light in both of the bowls, and then one light outside of the bowl shining up on the stream. Just adds, a really cool ambiance. One of my favorite things about aquatic lighting in particular, terrestrial lighting, up in trees and path lights along landscape, it's very, very pretty. But one of my favorite things about aquatic lighting is the water. It moves, and it has like ripples that it creates. And when the lights are inside of the water, when those ripples and the movement of the water happens, it creates like a flicker. Best way to describe it is how a candle flickers. A candle kind of gets really bright and then dims and gets really bright and dims and kind of goes up and down. It's really cool. This does the exact same thing when the lights are in the water. So especially with the canopy that is above this water feature, it's one of those things that is just going to bring them some delight and joy from a bunch of the other rooms in the house that cannot see this water feature. While it did take us an extra day to complete with the added complexity of the clay, our homeowner could not be more happy with the results. He even left us a 5-star review on Google. Now he has a fountain that not only looks good from the screened-in porch, lights up well at night and gives his canopy a flicker of candlelight. He also can water his garden, and not use city water. We're going to call this one a success. My brother did an awesome job creating this piece. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a great day.